My guest, Mr. John Moore. Welcome back to Late Night in the Midlands, John.
Michael, good to be with you. Thank you.
Terms. Oh, it's great to have you back. Thank you so much for the CDs as well. I definitely watched both of them.
Well, good. You did get a chance to watch them. Outstanding.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, I know you've been on the show a couple times before. We talked about this whole Planet X thing, but I'd like to really start right from scratch again, if we may. And because I'm on a new forum, and I have some new listeners as well. So, we've been really hitting on this topic as much as we can. And,
well, good. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, I think it's very important. So, John, why don't we start out and tell us a little bit about how you found out about this?
Okay, we'll begin at the beginning. In the late spring of 2000, a couple of research friends of mine, researchers, they approached me and started telling me about Planet X. And basically, once these men, by the way, they approached me independently. One did not know the other was even looking into this. I thought that both these men had a great need for tinfoil hats, quite frankly. But I trusted them enough that I went ahead and made an inquiry with a friend of mine who's connected to the lettered agencies, as we sometimes say. He promptly thought I needed a tinfoil hat also, but he made inquiries with people that would be in the know, and he got back with me 2-3 weeks later. He says, John, it's exactly what you said it is. The federal government of the United States has known about Planet X since at least 1979, and they've been preparing for it ever since. It turns out the government sent up the Pioneer 10 space probe looking for this thing in a certain part of space. They found it, and they've been tracking it ever since. Beginning in the early 1980s, the federal government also began letting contracts with private contractors to build shelters as part of continuity of government contingency planning. We've all seen the Jesse Ventura shows and what's been going on at the Denver airport.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fast forward about 5 years. I'm having lunch with a friend of mine I served with in the military, and he starts telling me about a classified briefing that he attended in 1985 when he was in the U.S. Navy Submarine Corps about rising ocean levels, violently rising ocean levels, and violent climate change. Shortly after that, he, along with some other veterans, which I'll tell you about, helped me recreate the map that all these veterans saw in these classified Navy briefings that began, by the way, in 1979, which leads to another veteran story. So that was in August of 2005. Just a couple months later, I had a speaking engagement to talk about terrorism at a university class, a class on international relations. There was a second speaker there. I had never met the man before. He is a retired intelligence officer. So we finished talking to the college students, and we go to a restaurant in Rolla, Missouri, and we're there at a table. I'm sitting across the table from the intelligence officer. His wife's sitting next to me. My friend, the college professor, is sitting at the same table. During the conversation, I found out he did a 3-year tour of duty in another service. That was the Navy Submarine Corps. He was not in the Navy. But this is pretty common for intelligence officers, is to do tours of duty with other services.
Okay.
So once I found this out, I knew I had to ask the question. I never met this man before. I knew I may never see him again. I said, tell me what you know about rising ocean levels. Before he can speak up, his wife sitting next to me speaks up. She says, John, we're getting ready to retire. We've been all over the planet with different duty assignments. We're at the Pentagon. We need to pick a place to retire. We picked the Arkansas, Missouri Ozarks because of rising ocean levels. Well, I knew I had what I was looking for then, another source. I made promptly on the spot, made an appointment to meet him a week later and have lunch and have him help me make further revisions in the same map I'd already began in August. Later that fall, I was conducting a pistol class. I teach concealed carry training. I am an NRA certified firearms instructor. During the lunch break, I found out one of my students was a retired Navy submarine officer. Well, we talked for a while, and I made a lunch appointment with him for the following week. And at that lunch appointment, he says, John, I signed a 5-year non-disclose agreement. I've only been out 3 years. If I talk about what I know, I could lose my pension. I said, well, can you do this? He's since died, by the way, of cancer. I said, Steve, can you blink your eyes once for yes and twice for no. He smiled and said, yes, I can do that. And he helped me make the final revisions in the map you saw on my DVD there, Michael.
Yes, that map was, it's kind of scary.
Well, it's about as scary as, I mean, it's maybe not quite as scary as what Gordon Michael Scallion's been publishing for more than 20 years, but it's certainly scary enough because what the Navy says, and what the Navy scientists, I should say, what they say will be underwater is basically where 60 to 75% of the people in this country live, which is the first 100 miles of the East Coast, the Gulf Coast coming inland, 100 plus miles, 150 miles, basically wiping out all of Florida, at least half of Alabama, about half of Mississippi, and almost all Louisiana, and going into about 100 or so miles into Texas. The West Coast taking damage 50 to 100 miles inland. It gets a lot higher, a lot quicker in most of the West Coast. The Pacific Northwest is referred to by geologists as a geological nightmare. For example, the Cascade Mountains are not mountains. They're all dormant volcanoes. Those aren't mountains at all. They're just dormant volcanoes, which, as we found out in the 1980s with Mount St. Helens, aren't actually all that dormant, are they?
No.
So, during these briefings, and I'll give you the story about how I backtracked to the first one in 1979. Okay. During these briefings, these men were told by the U.S. Navy, gentlemen, these events will happen in your lifetime, not your children's, not your grandchildren's. These events will happen in your lifetime. And they point out in the briefings 2 safe havens. One is the Arkansas, Missouri Ozarks, where most of these men have relocated to upon retirement. The other is the area of the border area of Wyoming and Montana, which may be safe from rising ocean levels and so forth, but is way too close to Yellowstone to suit my fancy. So, anyway, my first DVD, Global Warming, What the Government Came Out, and What the Government Isn't Telling You, came out in September 2008. In the spring of 2009, I had one of my listeners from my radio show bought a copy. He watched it, and he calls me up. He says, John, I was in the Navy in New Orleans in 1979. I was just a young sailor. They had me set up a briefing room for a weekend briefing of flag rank officers, and he says, John, admirals don't do weekend briefings. So he sets up the tables, the chairs, the light system, the sound system, and he sees a map on the wall. Nobody tells him what the map is, because he's not going to be in the briefing. He's just setting up the room. Mm-hmm. He says, John, all these admirals show up. They're smoking cigars, telling jokes, slapping each other on the back. How's the wife? How's the kids? Happy, go lucky. You know, it's peacetime. They're admirals, and life is grand. He said, John, when they left this briefing, they all looked like their puppy dog had died. And he said, I wondered for 30 years what the briefing was about and what that map meant, because nobody told him what the map meant. It was a classified briefing, and he saw the map.
So apparently these gentlemen were finding out for the first time, huh?
That's right. That was more likely than not, Michael, that was one of the very first briefings of high-ranking military officers in 1979 in New Orleans.
Wow.
Wow is right.
So then, I mean, how much time do we actually have with all this? I feel like it's close. I think that 2012 is definitely a deception. I think that what's going to happen is going to happen before 2012 or after it, but I don't think that date means much.
Well, Michael, you're right. 2012 is disinformation. It's obfuscation. I don't believe we have that long. I'm not naming any dates. Given the enormity, given the size of which is coming at us, people would be well advised to do what these Navy veterans do, which is get ready and start living a new life someplace fairly safe. Keeping in mind, there's no place that's absolutely safe. Some places clearly are safer than others, but there is no absolute safe place. That's what people would be well advised to do. However, I know most people won't do that for a variety of reasons, mainly economic.
Sure. I've heard it a million times over.
Yeah,
I can't afford to move anywhere.
Well, people create the reality that they live. They may not want to recognize that or admit it, but they do. Mm-hmm. And you and I aren't going to change that. I can recommend some books, but In fact, there's an excellent book that helps people realize their own potential. And I've read many of these books, I'm sure you have also. The title of it is The Power of Your Subconscious Mind by Mr. Murphy, Dr. Murphy, James Murphy.
Mm-hmm.
It's been around for about 40 years, keeps getting republished every few years. Excellent book, which does, by the way, conform to Christian values and principles. But getting back to this topic, most people, once they figure this out, if they do satisfy themselves that this is real, they're going to feel trapped by economic conditions to some major metropolitan area, most likely. And they may come up with some kind of plan to set up a safe haven at a remote location that they'll go to at the last minute and not before.
Right.
That's a lot of people making that choice, which I don't believe is the best choice, but that's reality for most people, well, many people, if they make a choice at all.
I've been warning people about this. I mean, for a while, I says I don't know exactly what's going to happen. I just know that this exists, because I heard about it back in 1983 when I was in high school. That's
right. I remember you talking about that. You had a very wise instructor in high school.
Yeah, he gave us a little science magazine. Couldn't have been more than 5-6 pages, just something that they got every week or whatever. And I remember reading about Planet X and coming home to my parents, and I was excited because I'm thinking maybe there's life on Planet X.
Well, 83 would have been about right. That's when some of the first public announcements were made. There were some public announcements made in that time frame. The New York Times ran an article. There was, about that same time, 82 or 83, there was a article in one of the major encyclopedias that never appeared again, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Not long after that, about 88 or so, everybody wants to hear credentials. We're talking about stars and science-related matters. People want to hear credentials, right?
Right.
Okay, how's this for credentials? Let's say you're going to draw a paycheck for looking at stars. How's this? Supervising astronomer of the United States Naval Observatory, Dr. Robert Harrington, Ph.D.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think his career path could have gone any further, and he could have achieved a greater achievement in that career path?
I think not.
Hardly.
Back an hour for anybody who might have questions. 803-748-9293. You can also call in using Skype to Skype, Late Night in the Midlands. The website, latenightinthemidlands.com. Go on over, become a member. You can listen live on the website, scroll down and join the chat. And don't forget about getting over there to project.nsearch.com. A lot of truth over there tonight. But tonight, our truth is coming from John Moore. We're talking Planet X. And again, after the hour, everybody's more than welcome to call in with any questions. So, John, we're back. And, yeah, so you were just saying about the observatory, I believe.
Absolutely. The United States Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C. is where their headquarters is. Dr. Harrington was interviewed, and it turns out what we have access to publicly is only 10 minutes of what was about a 1-hour interview. There's a DVD. It's offered at my website with that 10-minute clip, which is the smoking gun, you might say.
Mm-hmm.
The title of it is Are We Alone in the Universe? With Zachariah Sitchin at my website, thelibertyman.com. Anyway, in that interview, the clip that we can see, Dr. Harrington talks about Planet X as being scientific fact, not being scientific speculation. He gives its approximate size, 3 to 5 times the size of Earth. He says it has a far larger iron and nickel core, which gives it a lot more bang for the buck in terms of its effect on our planet and the sun and everything.
Mm-hmm.
He even describes its orbit. And he goes so far as to say he thinks it could support life as we know it, by the way.
Yeah, I've actually heard that. That was something I was going to bring up. I hear about the Anunnaki.
Well, it's when I first started hearing about this 6-7 years ago, I thought this is really strange.
Yeah.
How can life live on a planet that doesn't have a source of sunlight like we do, since it spends most of its time out in the far reaches of space?
Right.
Well, it turns out that these people, calling them people, they're not necessarily people like we know them, but they are human beings of some sort. They probably live inside the planet, and that's how they can survive and have what they need to live and thrive and so forth. It's a very big place. This planet is considerably larger, 3 to 5 times the size of Earth. And if there are Anunnakis or some human-type beings living on it, that's more than likely where they live, is inside the planet as opposed to on top of it like we do.
Well, I wish they'd build a steering column on that thing.
Well, despite the high technology they no doubt possess, I doubt that something that large can be steered by mere mortals.
Yeah.
Yeah, steer it away from us. Go someplace else. We don't need you. Good grief.
And this thing comes through every 3,600 years. And,
yes, sir.
And there is proof that this has happened before.
There is. In fact, one of my research associates, he's a Messianic Jew. He was giving a presentation. He gives presentations about what you and I are talking about, Michael, based on his study of the Torah, the Old Testament. He reached the same conclusions that I did by interviewing Navy veterans, that we go through this 3,600-year cycle, 2 of which are mentioned in the Torah in the Old Testament, the most recent being Moses' exodus out of Egypt about 3,600 years ago. And the time before that would have been the Noah's flood about 7,200 years ago.
Right. And that might even have something to do with Atlantis, huh?
That may have been even farther back, maybe even 3 cycles ago.
Okay, yeah, something like 11,000.
Yes, sir. And it's hard, when you get that far back, it's hard to really, especially where with the right equipment you can find the radioactive remains of nuclear devices being set off in the remote past, 12,000 plus years ago. Another bit of evidence, which I've satisfied myself, every U.S. senator knows about what I'm about to tell you, Michael.
Okay.
Of course, every president. Many people in certain areas of science, like the JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, NASA, of course, other similar organizations in Europe and Asia that are connected with government and space research. This object in space has 2 nicknames. The most well-known is the Black Knight. The other, which is far less known outside of government circles, is the chirogenic box. And here's the story. I first found out about this reading a book by the archaeologist Jonathan Gray, another man I encourage you to get on the show if you haven't had him. He's an archaeologist in New Zealand.
No, I haven't had him, and I'd really like to.
Oh, you need to.
Okay.
He's written a number of books. The first book I read, and on the first page of that first book, is titled Dead Man's Secrets. And on that first page, he talks about the Black Knight satellite. And here's the story. 1959, the first modern man-made satellite went up called the Sputnik, about the size of a grapefruit. A few months later, the first American satellite went up, about the size of a basketball. Sputnik, of course, was Russian, and ours went up a few months after that. Optical and radar tracking stations were set up all over the planet to track these new man-made devices. It was only a few months before they found a man-made device already up there. It caused great stir, great commotion at the time. In fact, I have a Time magazine, an original Time magazine, the complete magazine from that period of time, the spring of 1959, where they're trying to backpedal and convince people it was something that it's not. This object is on a polar orbit, not an equatorial orbit. In 1959, we could not do polar orbits. It was about 20 years before we could do polar orbits as opposed to equatorial orbits. In the mid to late 70s, we could finally do polar orbits. The size of the object, I have 2 or 3 dimensions, 40 by 70 feet. I don't have the 3rd dimension, which is probably 10 or 20 or 30 or whatever feet in rough dimensions.
Right.
Once I ran across this thing, Michael, it became a matter of highest national priority, as well as highest national security, to gain access to the contents of this box, retrieve them, and start reverse engineering them. Very likely, the entire Apollo space project was a cover to have the excuse to spend the money and shoot these really big, heavy rockets up into space. By the late 60s, we had the ability to get as high as it is. This thing is just below the Van Allen radiation belt, about 22,000 miles high, which I don't believe modern man has ever crossed, by the way, because the lead shielding would weigh more than they can get up there, even now.
Really?
Yeah.
I've always wondered about that moon landing.
Well, two things about the moon landing. First of all, the sky has no stars. Second of all, the American flag is waving in the breeze.
Right, that's the same thing I say.
Guess what? There's no breeze on the moon.
That's what I said.
And the third thing, I don't want to dwell on it and go down that rabbit trail, but the third thing, the surface of the moon is covered by this talcum powder dust type substance, and they left a camera behind to film the takeoff of the lunar lander.
Yeah.
And these powerful, extremely powerful rockets fire up and blast off, and guess what? No dust moves. It's a hoot. It's really a hoot. But there's some a lot of good documentation on the fabrication of the moon landing. But getting back to the Black Knight satellite, a friend of mine is very good friends with a United States senator. There's only 100 of these men and women, by the way.
Right.
Just 100. Very exclusive club.
Mm-hmm.
And I gave my friend the briefing that I just gave you and your listeners about the Black Knight satellite, and I said to him, ask your friend a senator. And so he did, and he asked the senator, and here's the senator's first response. Tell me what you know first.
That right there gives it away.
My friend went ahead and gave the briefing as I just did. My friend initially just asked the question to the senator, tell me what you know about the Black Knight satellite. And that's when the senator gave the response, tell me what you know first. Here's the deal with classified information, Michael. If somebody has signed non-disclosure agreements and they have this information, once they find out you also know what they know, then they feel pretty comfortable talking about it because they're not revealing anything that you don't already know.
Right. Okay.
And that's what the senator was doing, and that's what is expected for men and women who have signed these non-disclosure agreements and know about this kind of information. So now I've told you what I know. Definitely. Now I'll get into the speculation area. I think by the late 60s we had the lift capability to get that high. So they would get up next to this thing and take photographs and detailed measurements of the docking mechanism for the Black Knight satellite, come back down, build a docking mechanism that would fit and link up with the Black Knight satellite, link it up, and get the door open. Who wants to be the first guy through the door? I mean, can you imagine walking inside a box in space that's been there for 12,000 years?
I couldn't imagine it at all.
I mean, it makes these Raiders of the Lost Ark movies and these space adventures seem puny by comparison, don't they?
They sure do.
Oh, my goodness. Whoa, baby. And not be able to talk about it on top of it once you get back.
So do you think they were able to actually download the data from this thing?
I believe they retrieved objects from in there.
Oh.
Brought those objects back. If they could get in there and have a living environment where they could have breathable air and enough heat to keep people warm, they may have just took it over and started working in there. I don't know. There's a lot of I don't knows here.
Right.
They definitely have the ability with protective equipment to get in there, recover equipment, bring it back to Earth, and begin the process of reverse engineering, beginning with metallurgy. You need to figure out what metal something's made out of, and going into all the electronic and electrical components. I know from another privileged source that even predating the discovery of the Black Knight satellite, what fell into the desert in 1947, that there was an object recovered out there, and the reverse engineering immediately began from that, the Roswell incident.
That's right.
It was not just a few years later, in the mid-'50s, I believe the three scientists, was it Westinghouse, that took credit for the creation of the transistor?
I think so.
Yes. Three scientists from the Westinghouse laboratories took credit for creating and inventing the transistor, which was nothing more than reverse engineered alien technology, is all that was.
See, so they can get here, so then it is possible to get out there. It's just you don't think that, not with the conventional crap really we've used.
Well, the one caveat, you get into things that are so difficult to talk about publicly because of the controversy involved.
Sure.
What the Germans were doing in World War II and before World War II, what the drawings I've seen of metal flying machines from the early to mid-1930s. I mean, these guys had blueprints, working blueprints to build metal airplanes. Not very long after our first airplanes were just kites,
Mm-hmm.
Kites with motors. The Wright brothers,
Yeah.
And of course, they had working models, operational, high-performance metal jet aircraft in the mid-1940s. So yeah, I mean that's the German science and the whole space race up until very recently. All the space race was between Russia and the United States was our German scientists versus their German scientists.
Yeah, it sure was.
That's all it was.
Now, with the finding of this black box, then that definitely proves that there was advanced.
Well, there's plenty of evidence.
Yeah.
And this brings into, there's a lot of overlapping things here, Michael, like the theory of evolution, which is a theory, has no evidence, and never will have any evidence of a worm becoming a man. I mean, seriously, that evidence it didn't exist 160 years ago, it doesn't exist now, it will never exist. But when it comes to something very in front of us, like the Great Pyramid at Giza, when you have the largest commercial construction companies on the planet saying, we can't do that, now, in 2011, we can't do that.
Right.
What are people left with? Well, books saying it was aliens that did it. We can't possibly have plain barefoot peasants like myself and you, Michael, doing something like that in the distant past. We even today, we still don't know how old the Great Pyramid at Giza is. There's no hieroglyphics inside there. There's simply, you can't tell by looking at rock how old it is.
No.
It's all guesswork. And the Sphinx nearby is now we know much older and has water lines from water being submerged for we don't know how many centuries.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, how have these artifacts been surviving these hits? They've had to.
Well, not all of them do, obviously.
Oh, okay.
But many do, and we continue now. My friend Professor McCanning, and we have visited personally, and we've become friends. He says that 90% of what's out there to be found as far as archaeological stuff is yet to be found. But just in the last 2 years, in a valley in Bosnia, they found 8 very large pyramids, one of which is just about as big, if not bigger, than the Great Pyramid at Giza. The first archaeological dig took place this past summer, 2010. They're just now scratching the surface of this collection of pyramids in Bosnia. Then about, 5 or 6 years ago, it was confirmed that in the far western side of China, there's a pyramid about 2.5 times the size of the Great Pyramid at Giza.
Yeah, I've heard that there's even pyramids on Mars.
Well, we've heard that also, and I've seen the photographs, and I've been a guest on Stuart Best's show. Stuart Best has done some interesting research and all that. But these stories come up, like the pyramid in China, and you never hear about it again, do you? No,
you don't. I was going to say that as well. With the mainstream media, newspapers, you don't hear any of this stuff.
No, and as business-like as the the Chinese are, you would think they want to put in a nice airport and some 3-star, 4-star hotels to bring in the tourists.
No, you know, I heard that they were actually building on the coastlines, that they were building cities on the coastlines, and I wonder if they're not...
Actually, that's not where they're building them. The new cities that have no people, the ones you're talking about, they're in the deep interior of China. Yeah, that's where they are. They're in the deep interior of China, and you've seen aerial photographs like I have, with these beautiful, brand new, huge cities where several million people could live, and there's virtually no people there. What appears to be maybe the cleaning crew, or maybe some construction people still there.
Yeah, well, you know, I thought they were building towards the coast, maybe to say, okay, we're going to get the people here that we want to get rid of. We got a top of the hour break coming up here fairly soon. Yes, we do.
But this whole China thing needs to be talked about, because it all plays into what we're going to be looking at very, very shortly here. Okay,
great. Well, let's take this break. This is a little longer one here. So, yeah, let's take this break, and we come back. Let's talk about that. Okay, John?
Okay, I'll be standing by.
All right, we'll be back in just a little bit. I'm Michael Vera. This is Late Night in the Midlands. Again, the call-in number, 803-748-9293. Or you can call in using Skype. Just Skype to Skype, Late Night in the Midlands. It's that easy, and you can get on and talk to John Moore. I'm telling you, this guy is the real deal. He's... his information comes not from books that he's read, but from reliable sources, okay? And shortly, as we get into the show just a little more, he'll even tell you some Google searches you can do will really back up a lot of the stuff he's saying. But with that being said, we're going to take this break. I'm John. We're back, and we're discussing China now.
Well, China is a big player in many things these days. We all know that. And what China is doing is very important once you understand the things that you and I are talking about. Okay, where do we begin?
I know there's so much.
I know. Well, it's about the same time Russia started building these massive underground shelters, which was just after the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s. We found out that China was doing the same thing. In addition, before we go any further, you need to recognize that China's going to lose a large percentage, 25-30% of their agricultural area is going to be underwater in the not too distant future, which of course is also where tens of millions of their people live. Going to be underwater, maybe even hundreds of millions. They do have more than 1 billion people, of course.
Sure.
And China's, like most countries, the large percentage of their population lives within 100 miles of a major body of water, in this case the Pacific Ocean. There's a piece of real estate called the Hindu Kush, which is Afghanistan, very mountainous part of Afghanistan that touches the Chinese border, kind of a narrow strip of land. And the Chinese have built a highway coming out of China through the Hindu Kush, crossing Afghanistan, going into Iran, crossing Iran, going into Iraq, crossing Iraq, going into Saudi Arabia, where it gets to the Red Sea, the Suez Canal. They have two choices to cross there. One would be over the Suez Canal, which is what they're doing now. The other is to use ferries, and they may even build a causeway across the Red Sea there at the end of the peninsula where the Red Sea joins with the ocean. From that point, we get into a story told to me by a friend of mine. He has spent an entire year doing intelligence work for the U.S. Army, Command Sergeant Major Page. He got back this past fall. Him and another individual with the Navy driving around Central Africa with cameras and recording devices and so forth, documenting what the People's Liberation Army is doing in Central Africa, which is the following: building highways, building water treatment plants, sewage treatment plants, power plants, hospitals, and airstrips. All the things that you would need for infrastructure if you were going to go there and do something involving a lot of people.
So they're setting it up.
Well, they're setting it up. Central Africa has very rich soil. It will be relatively, when I say all these things are relatively unaffected by the things that we're concerned about with Planet X and Earth changes and so forth. A very desirable place for China to come in and basically take over, which is clearly, from what I've seen and heard, what they intend to do. And they're setting up all the infrastructure to do that. In addition, I've interviewed on my Sunday show several times in the past month a journalist by the name of Alexander Bachman. Alexander is a Mexican journalist. He's bilingual, speaks perfect English and perfect Spanish. Lives about 60 miles south of San Diego in Mexico there. He's debriefed and interviewed a number of first-hand witnesses to People's Liberation Army, people, soldiers, supplies, and equipment in Mexico. He explored and described in great detail the new highway built by the Chinese in Mexico.
Well, they're getting around, aren't they?
Well, they are. In fact, he told me about Russia, the state of Mexico that borders the southwest part of Texas. I'm going to look at my map here real quick so I can tell you where this is in regards to Texas, right across the border from Brownsville, Rio Bravo, McAllen, Texas, Roma, Texas, Zapata, Texas. It's here's if I can say this Mexican name, Tamaulipas. Russia tried to buy the state from Mexico.
Really?
They did. What a hoot!
It's kind of like us buying Alaska.
Well, yeah, there is precedence for that, obviously. You saw my DVD where I talked about the I-35 corridor.
Yes, I did.
Now, we all hear, your listeners listen to Patriot Radio and alternative media. Obviously, they wouldn't be listening to you and I talk right now.
That's right.
The Patriot argument about the I-35 corridor is, it violates our sovereignty. They're using foreign contractors. It's not good. Is that pretty accurate?
It sure is.
Okay. The Chamber of Commerce argument is, it'll be good for America, good for jobs, good for business, rah, rah, rah. Pretty accurate?
Sure is.
Does either side say why they're building the darn thing in the first place? No.
No, they can't tell us.
They can't. I mean, we have perfectly functional railroads, perfectly functional superhighways, pipelines, and rivers with locks and dams that take care of everything that needs to be transported right now. Very well, thank you very much, don't we?
Yes, we do.
Well, if those wonderful riverways with the docks and dams were gone, if many of the highways were broken and damaged and destroyed, if the railroads, many of them were broken, damaged, and destroyed, pipelines the same way, wouldn't we need something running right up through the middle of the country, through the heartland, through the most productive agricultural real estate on the planet to move the grain? Yes, we would. Yes, and that's why this is being built. It's being built because it's going to be needed.
But will it survive Planet X?
Well, there's no way to know that in advance. They're doing everything humanly possible to build it in the safest part of the country they can, keeping in mind that there's no guarantees, and they'll have the resources to make repairs as needed.
Sure. So now, when we talk about this, China's getting well prepared. Now nobody has come out and told their people yet, right? No other countries.
Norway is one of the countries that is right at the edge of being pretty open with that. I can't tell you why, but they've been more open with their people than most countries. And there was another country which it's not coming to mind right this moment. But there is another country that's been more open with their people than our country has been, or any of the others as far as that goes.
John, I put in the coordinates where Planet X is supposed to be. Apparently, as the story goes, back in 2007, a gentleman recorded this through a telescope of some sort. He put it on YouTube, and they apparently blocked it. So now somebody else is giving the coordinates of where this is supposed to be. Well, I got on and I went to look, and I think a lot of people have seen this already, but if you go to Google Sky and you go to look in that particular section of the stars, there's a big black square where it's black.
That's right. I've seen that big black square. It is real. It does exist. And it's the only part of the sky that's blacked out by Google Sky.
It is, and you can tell. I mean, for one, it's a perfect square. For another, at the bottom, there's a star. Nice, big, bright star, and it's cut right in half.
Right.
So, you think with all the technology they have, they could have at least doctored it up a little,
Well, you see, men and women that know about astronomy, they know what should be where. And if something's missing, they'll be on top of it in a heartbeat.
I've gotten a hold of several amateur astronomers about this, and only one out of probably a dozen got back to me, and I asked them to please take me serious, and I told them about my concerns with all this. And one guy, he did get back to me, and he says, well, everything seems to be where it's supposed to be, blah, blah, blah. And I gave him the coordinates. I said, I want you to go take a look at this, and you'll notice it's blacked out on Google Sky. You tell me why. And now I haven't heard back from him, and it's been about a week. I'm wondering if he packed up and ran already.
Well, my laugh brings up something important. You need to keep your sense of humor about these things, Michael.
You do.
I did a presentation to a live audience Saturday in Doolittle, Missouri, near Rolla, Missouri, in south central Missouri, near my home. And during that, it was a long presentation. It went on from noon till 5 o'clock, 5 hours with some breaks. I asked my audience if there was any combat veterans in there besides myself, and I asked there were two other combat veterans. I said, gentlemen, is it true that the man in combat who doesn't have a sense of humor is going to get himself hurt and everybody around him? And they nodded in agreement.
Oh, sure. I agree.
Yeah, and that's very true. And we're talking about very serious things here.
We sure are. I mean,
it doesn't. It's not the end of the world. This happens every 3,600 years. On one hand, on the other, it's the end of the world that we know, that we're familiar with.
Exactly. That's what I tell everybody. It's not the end of the world. It's just the end of the world as we know it.
Precisely.
Mm-hmm.
Which is no small thing.
No,
and
it's not.
The loss of human life is going to be of biblical proportions. Not necessarily the direct consequence of Planet X, but the secondary effects of people losing access to potable water, which is what kills most babies in the world that die under age 5 right now, is simply bad water, which leads to diarrhea, dehydration, and death.
That's right. Now, you recommend some stuff on your CD, certain water filters and so on.
Right.
And at some point near the end of the show, I definitely would like to get into some of that stuff. So if people...
right, we can talk about preparedness towards the end, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, related to Planet X, where exactly your best guesstimate? Maybe you know for sure, but where exactly is it right now? How?
It's south. Well, there's something called the elliptical plane. All the planets, the normal 9 planets, revolve around the sun in a flat plane. Mm-hmm. It's coming up from the south of that plane, which is why there's been so much attention given to the Antarctic, because they can set up their equipment there and look at it most of the time. My understanding is that right now, even if you're that far south, you still need infrared capability to be able to see it with your telescope. But there was something in the news recently you may have heard of, Michael. That's the fact we may wake up one morning in 2011 and see 2 suns in the sky.
Yeah, I heard about, NASA come out. I was telling people this when this story first come out. I said, you know what? I said, they're preparing you. That's what
right.
they're doing.
I ran this concept past Professor McCanny. What they're saying is a star out towards the constellation Orion is going to go nova, explode, and you'll be able to see it in the sky for several months as a second sun. Here's McCanny's response. First of all, he says, John, when a star goes nova, typically it lasts for a few days to maybe 3 or 4 weeks at the most, typically is what happens. So it would be highly, highly unusual to have that event be visible in the sky for 3 or 4 months. In addition, he says, and he agrees, what NASA is putting out may be, and emphasize maybe, a cover story to convince people that when the 10th planet is in the sky, it's no big deal. We've heard about it before. Go to work Monday morning, pay your mortgage, and pick up a six-pack of beer on the way home that night. And I wondered for years, Michael, what will the powers that be do when people can look up in the sky and see this thing?
And now we're getting our answers.
I believe we are. I do truly believe we're getting our answer. Yes, absolutely.
I don't believe any explanations that come from government or NASA. You know, I'll listen, and then I'll, you know, check into it and make my own assumptions. But I know this Planet X thing is real. And when they came out, and I saw they even called it a brown dwarf star.
Right.
Behind the sun, they said it was located. And I said to myself, oh, my God, here they go. Here they go. They're already starting to cover it up.
Right.
Because they know we're going to be seeing it soon.
Absolutely. Absolutely. People, you know, in the patriot community, alternative media, you've heard this, I know, many times, Michael. The powers that be want to declare martial law. You've heard that, right?
Yes, sir, I have.
Okay. I disagree. I don't believe they want to. I believe they will when they have no choice. Martial law is very disruptive. The powers that be need FedEx and UPS and the United States Mail Service to work just like the rest of us do. You know what? They need spare parts also.
That's right.
And martial law disrupts everything. Why in the world would they want to hurt themselves? Now, when the time comes, you would declare martial law, and so would I, Michael, because we'd have no choice. And that's when they'll declare martial law, when there's no choice. Because it will be the right thing to do, and in fact, the only thing to do, because people are going bonkers.
Yeah, you know, I brought it up the other night. I says, you know, you look at how people act on Black Friday. They stampede each other over a $10 toaster.
Right, right.
You know, and can you imagine the announcement goes out, how it would be? The stores would be empty so quick.
Well, we saw in the LA riots what people do if they think there's no consequences.
That's right.
And that's what was happening in Los Angeles. What was it, 88? Has it been that long ago?
I think it has been.
Yeah. People in Los Angeles, many of them, not all of them, but many of them thought they could do anything they wanted with no consequences. To a certain extent, that happened in New Orleans. We had police officers stealing new Cadillacs in uniform out of the showrooms.
Yeah. I mean, not to mention police officers who shot defenseless people.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. So when people think, and there's a percentage of people who are at the edge of psychosis anyway. If you look at the millions of Americans who take psychotropic drugs, prescription drugs, the millions who are addicted to street drugs, and who have severe behavior problems related to alcohol, that's a fairly substantial percentage of adults in this country that are held in check by fear of being arrested.
Yeah, and you know, when the going gets tough, I could see it turning into a live video game of Night of the Living Dead. You know, just
absolutely.
Yeah, you're gonna have
absolutely, and we've seen that in our lifetimes. I'm old enough to remember the Watts riots in the late '60s and Detroit riots in the '60s, and of course we had more recently the LA riots we just talked about, and the Hurricane Katrina just 6-7 years ago, whenever it was.
Yeah, yeah. And, you know, something else I want to talk about, I don't want to get into it just yet, but I want to talk about this New World Order thing, because I think I've kind of got it figured out just a little bit.
Well, we can talk about that when it's time.
Okay.
It does play into it, everything else, as you might expect it would.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, John, we have to take another break.
All right. I'll stand by.
All right. We'll be a few minutes, so we'll be back in a moment. I am Michael Vera. My guest is John Moore. This is Late Night in the Midlands. The number to call in is 803-748-9293, or you can call in using Skype. Just Skype to Skype. Late Night in the Midlands. And don't forget about getting over there to latenightinthemidlands.com. Become a member. Tell your friends, tell your family about it. You know, I hope some of you are listening and taking this just a little more serious, because I'll tell you, since I started this show, I'm taking this a lot more serious than I did, say, 2.5, 3 years ago. And hopefully you are.
people initially expose this material. They want to see the map first of all. They want to see if Aunt Nellie's house in Florida is going to be underwater. You know.
Yeah.
And they feel, well, if they're 50 miles or 100 miles from that line on the map that the Navy drew, they're going to be okay. Nothing could be further from the truth.
Do tell.
Well, the areas being devastated is where more than half the people in this country live. There's 350 million people in the United States right now. Areas where about 200 million people are going to be wiped out. Many of them are going to survive and become refugees.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say you're sitting back in the Appalachian Mountains, for example, which people think, well, they'll be safe in the Appalachian Mountains. My response is maybe. Between Washington and D.C. and Boston is basically one continuous, very large city,
right,
with about 50 million plus people living between Washington, D.C. and Boston. Those people many of them, probably half or more, will become refugees. The average tank of fuel in an automobile will give you about a 300-mile range. Most people have about a half a tank at any given moment, which means if you're within 150 miles of a major metropolitan area, you're going to be at risk of having uninvited refugees show up at your doorstep if you think you've got a safe place.
Mm-hmm.
That's very real. The Navy designated the Arkansas, Missouri Ozarks as a safe haven for the following reasons. Maybe this will make some more sense to people. The distance from a major body of water. The nearest ocean is the Gulf of Mexico, which is hundreds of miles away. Altitude above sea level, typically 800 to 1,200 feet above sea level. A very long growing season, a relatively mild winter, a lot of water. There's more bridges in southern Missouri than in any state in the United States, by the way. Majority of them low water bridges, creek crossings. And a very homogeneous population, mostly white Anglo-Saxon Protestant for the most part. And no major cities. There's no major city in the Arkansas, Missouri Ozarks. The largest city is Springfield, Missouri, population about 250,000. The three metropolitan areas that are near the Ozarks but not in the Ozarks are Kansas City, St. Louis, and Memphis.
Right.
None of which are in the Ozarks. Those things all combine to make the Arkansas, Missouri Ozarks a designated safe haven by the United States Navy.
Because not many people are going to be able to get to it.
Not really. It's a long. The Mississippi River, and I didn't mention this yet. According to the U.S. Navy, not John Moore. This is all Navy information, by the way, not my information. It's classified Navy information. The Mississippi River will become 50 to 100 miles wide, 100 to 200 feet deep. That will effectively split the country in two, north, east, west, at the Mississippi River. Denver, obviously, will be the capital of the western side of the country, and Atlanta is the highest altitude major city east of the Mississippi. It will become the eastern capital, and of course, it's a great risk for not surviving for a number of reasons. You don't build bridges across rivers 50 miles wide. The locks and dams will be wiped out, of course. The existing bridges will no longer matter. Even if they're standing, they'll go from water to water.
Right.
Once you're east of Mississippi, Michael, the population density per square mile dramatically increases over and above what it is west of the Mississippi River. There's lots of very remote areas east of the Mississippi River, and you may fool yourself into thinking, well, I'm in the country. Well, yes, you may be in the country. You may not have nearby neighbors, but there's millions of people not too far away.
That's right.
Absolutely.
Now, you mentioned Atlanta as being one of the capitals.
Right.
Now, is that to say that Atlanta's going to, make it through this?
Well, the government is planning on Atlanta, and in fact, Augusta, Georgia is getting a new NSA installation built there as we speak.
Oh.
Augusta is about the same altitude as Atlanta, I believe. Close enough. Look at what the agencies are doing. National Security Agency, the CIA, the people who take care of studying anthrax and foot and mouth disease at Plum Island. In fact, Jesse Ventura covered that in one of his shows.
Moving it inland.
Yes. I'm sure almost everybody listening to you and I talk have high-speed internet access.
Mm-hmm.
Put this in Google Images. Plum Island, New York. Plum Island, New York in Google Images. And you'll find two things. Well, more than that, but specifically, you'll be looking for aerial photographs and topographical maps.
Okay.
In the aerial photographs, you'll see what looks to be a 200-acre golf course with a few buildings on it. Now, the publicly stated reason for moving the Plum Island Animal Research Facility, where they study really fun stuff like foot and mouth disease and anthrax, the publicly stated reason is, quote-unquote, we've ran out of room on Plum Island. Well, the images on Google Image certainly make that instantly appear to be a complete lie and fabrication, which it is.
It is.
It is, absolutely. And where are they moving it? To the most valuable agricultural real estate on the planet, Manhattan, Kansas. Good grief. You know?
That's very dangerous, but they have to do it because they
have no choice.
Mm-hmm.